And we're told that the use of charts can be utilized to allow people to understand what took others hours and long periods of time to understand in just a few short minutes, because they can synthesize large amounts of data in a single image. And that's why charts are very important. There's 3 charts that we should know and understand. The first one was the 1843 chart. This was created during that year, and what it did was it summarized the visions of Daniel and Revelation, starting with Daniel 2, and you have the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he saw the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the hips of brass, the legs of iron, and then the feet of iron and clay. And he moves through the entire progression of Daniel 7, of Daniel 8. He goes into the book of Revelation 13, with the beasts, and we see all the way even with the woes, with the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. All of this is outlined in these charts, which shows the fulfillment of these prophecies in Daniel and Revelation, and the dates associated with their fulfillments. There wasn't a single verse that was left misunderstood. It was all completely revealed in the time. The 1850 chart was a expansion upon the 1843 chart in greater detail, more imaging, more names and details of things. I just wanted you all to see these things. You could just sit for hours and just read everything on them, and it's so informative, and you can see it all, and you can find the verses where it all lines up, and it's truly a blessing. One of the ones that most people have never seen was the chart created by J.V. Himes, and this was created in 1843 as well, and it was a pictorial chart of Daniel's visions. So this is only on the book of Daniel, and he goes through and shows things such as the 2300 days, which started in 457 and expanded, see this major arc, all the way until 1844. And you have many of the smaller visions. You have the ram and the he-goat and the rise of the little horn power, and you have the papal Rome. You have a lot of these arcs, and he shows a breakdown of the ruling of these empires using a different visual representation. And the keynote one is really understanding the 2300 days, because that's the mother of all the prophecies given in Daniel. And aside from just knowing it starts from the decree to go forth and rebuild Jerusalem, given by Artaxerxes in 457, and knowing that it ends on October 22nd, 1844, exactly 2,300 years later, because everybody in the room, if you're Adventist, you know this. But what does it mean? Like, what's the point? And so we're going to learn a deeper understanding of why this is so significant. And we're going to look at these texts. So I want to show, I didn't mean to click out of that. I'm going to bring up a text here. And this is where we find this. In Daniel chapter 8, verses 13 to 27 is the summary of the core in the book of Daniel regarding the 2300-day vision. I want to ask some questions as we look at this passage, because it's very, very, very important. And we're going to try to make a better understanding regarding this vision. It says, "Then in verse 13, I heard one saint speaking and said unto another saint," so this is a conversation between Jesus Christ and the angel Gabriel, "which spake, saying, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation? To give both the daily and the transgression of desolation, the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot." So the Lord's sanctuary and the host are his people. "And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." So there's a prophetic time period given. We know each day for a year is 2,300 days, so it's 2,300 years into the future. Something would take place from this event where it would pertain to the sanctuary beginning to be cleansed. In verse 15, "And it came to pass when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man understood." So again, there's this figure commanding Gabriel to tell Daniel to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, and I fell upon my face, and he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. My email. And verse 27, I, Daniel, which is true, wherefore shut up thou the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So quite the cryptic passage. Not only do we see this focus of a vision being given, we see, I underlined some key phrases in this passage about understanding and not understanding. And we see Daniel go back and forth. In the beginning, he's saying, well, how long is this vision pertaining to the sanctuary? Then he says, I sought for an understanding. Verse 15. Verse 16, Gabriel's told by Christ, make Daniel understand. So he's been given permission to understand this vision. And he says unto me in verse 17, understand. So Gabriel's coming to Daniel. I've come to tell you what it means. Then in verse 26, he says, Daniel says this vision is true. But then he says, shut thou up the vision, which means make it so it can't be understood. Conceal it. For it shall be for many days. And then Daniel faints, and then he's astonished at the vision, but then he says no one else understood it. So do you see this going back and forth here? This interplay of understanding, not understanding, something I understand, but this I don't understand. Do you see Daniel's having this struggle, and he's writing it out here as he's being told, understand, don't understand, seal this up, understand this, don't understand this. And so why is it so cryptic? Why is that so confusing? I mean, it sounds like God's trying to make it hard to understand to me. So I want to share a clue what's going on here. How many people are familiar with the book written by Charles Dickens in 1859, A Tale of Two Cities? Is anybody familiar with this literary work? Yeah. I had to read it in AP literature as in high school. And I don't think I really understood it back in the day. It makes more sense now. The opening line of this book is one of the most famous literary lines in English literature. And I put the quote here. It says, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light and the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope and it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven and we were all going direct the other way. A Tale of Two Cities. So this is about this conflict between London and Paris, and the main antagonist of the book was what figure? Does anybody know? What was the antagonist of the book that everybody was afraid of? The antagonist was La Guillotine. If you look in the picture, what's shown on the book? The guillotine. Because they were beheaded for standing up for their faith between this conflict between the rich Roman Catholics and the poor working class. And there was this big, it was about the French Revolution, where the poor rose up against the Catholic Church in rebellion to being persecuted. And it's quite interesting. We know France is prophesied in Revelation chapter 11 as this country coming up out of the abyss at the time of the end after 1798, persecuting the two witnesses, which was the Old and New Testament. It says they burned the Bibles in the streets because they rose up in rebellion against God, because all they knew about the Bible was what the Catholic Church told them, which was this horrible oppression of truth. So this Tale of Two Cities is quite interesting as it relates to the vision in Daniel chapter 8. Does anybody know why? Why I made the connection?
No, but I think it's really interesting. I went to a public school, and that was required reading.
Yeah.
And at that time, I understood the book, but not in relative to what you're talking about now.
Right, yeah. So if you look at this passage in Daniel 8 in the language it was written, it actually reveals why it's so confusing. So in yellow, we saw the words for vision in English. However, in Chaldean, the original text of the book of Daniel, the words are totally different words. Every other one's referring to something different. It's not the same thing. When I learned this, I was shook. Well, I remember years ago when I learned that the word vision in Daniel 8 is not translated the same in the original language, that it's actually two different visions, two dueling visions, a tale of two visions that's being given to Daniel simultaneously. And it says one he's allowed to understand and one he's not allowed to understand because of what they are. And this is key to understanding the prophecy of the 2300 days in Daniel 8. And it actually explains a lot, and that's what we're going to learn. You see, Daniel asks, how long shall be the Chazone, which concerns the daily and the transgression of desolation that destroys and wars against the sanctuary. And he says, pertaining to the Chazone, I sought for a meaning. But when God comes down and sends Gabriel to Daniel, God tells Gabriel, reveal to Daniel the meaning of the Mareh, a totally different vision. And so by the time you get to verse 26, Daniel says, the Mareh, which is the vision of the evening mornings, the 2300 days, is true. He says, I have understood it, and I can affirm to you this moment, the Mareh is true. I get it. It makes sense. Wherefore, shut up thou the Chazone. So the Chazone gets sealed off, and Daniel doesn't talk any more about it. Very interesting. So, we have to transition to this one now. Shut thou up the vision. In Daniel 8:26, when we see the comparison of these two visions, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore thou shut up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Which vision was shut up? We saw in the original language that the Chazone was sealed. In Daniel 8:27, I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. It's important to note also he fainted here. It was so much information, he fatigued himself into wearying himself, I faint. He couldn't continue the class. You ever been in school for 8 hours? I just can't go on. I'm ready for a nap. Daniel was fatigued. He faints. And so this is why there's this disjoint pause between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, where it says, when Daniel was praying at the evening oblation, the angel Gabriel came to me. In Daniel 9, it says, make thee understand the vision. And he says, from the going forth of decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, Daniel 9:24, he gets the rest of this vision being told to him that not only deals with the time, but when it begins. And the explanation for that break is because Daniel faints in Daniel 8, and Gabriel has to come back. So, we know now that Daniel didn't understand one of these visions, but he was told to be given understanding pertaining to the other one. We know that the first vision he said is true, but the other vision was for many days, very nondescript. So these two visions, the Mareh, which is true, and the Chazone, which is shut up, are here contrasted in the passage. So the Mareh and the Chazone. Daniel used two words for vision to clearly differentiate between the vision that is sealed and that which was not sealed. One vision, so here's where we have to start making observations. One vision is related to time, and the other vision is related to a fulfillment of events not directly tied to time. It's unrelated to time itself. So let's look at the Mareh more closely. A vision related to time, because in Daniel 8:14, the Mareh was a reference to the 2300 evening mornings. When we read in Daniel 8:14 that thou shalt unto 2,300 days, the word days there is plural, and it literally translates in the original language 2,300 evening mornings in the original language. It doesn't just say days. It's precisely 2,300 evening mornings, which is why in Daniel 8, verse 26, he says, the vision pertaining to the evening and mornings is true. He's saying the event related to this time period, the 2,300 evening mornings, is the one I'm talking about, the Mareh. He says the vision is true, and this vision was not sealed up. We're going to understand why. Now when we look at the Chazone, the vision is for many days. It's just a long vision. There's no time event associated with this. The vision is related to the fulfillment of many chronological events irrespective of timeline. When we look at the Chazone in reference to the passage in Daniel chapter 8, we find this is the one pertaining to the vision about the rising and the falling of the kingdoms, represented by the ram, which is Medo-Persia, the goat, which was Greece, and the little horn, which is pagan, and then papal Rome, and their destruction coming at the end of time at the second coming of Christ, as the passage says. So we see this progression of powers without relation to time, all the way up to the second coming. So here's a visualization. The Mareh is a definite period of time which spans from 457 BC to 1844, exactly 2,300 years to the day. But it doesn't expand beyond that. When you read the Chazone, it says that it goes into the time of the end where it finds a fulfillment, but it's not said when that fulfillment occurs. But it pertains to these events of the daily persecution of God's people, that wars against the sanctuary and the host. And then it goes on and it lists there was the ram and the goat and the beast and all of these rising and falling of empires. So then what's revealed beyond the little horn, it just says the time of the end. And it says it shall be for many days. So once we enter the time of the end, it says that's when it says time shall be no longer, because there is no more definite reckoning of time. After the time of the end, we enter that period. It says there's no more prophetic sequence of time. It's just for many days until these physical events take place. There's no more predicting it's that time period today. And he says, and this part of the vision was sealed until the time of the end, as we saw in Daniel 8. Seal thou the part of the vision until the time of the end. So in this sealing had to do with the correlation of the cleansing of the sanctuary. So here's a side-by-side comparison. The Mareh was a prophetic delineation based on time, the 2300 days. The Chazone was a prophetic delineation of events unrelated to time. The Mareh went exactly to 1844. The Chazone extends until the second coming of Jesus. Daniel 8, the beginning of the Mareh was really expounded upon in Daniel 9 when it would begin. That's the key that explains when it starts. The Chazone was explained in Daniel 8:20 to 25. He says, the ram, the goat, which thou sawest, are these nations, these empires. And it says the Mareh was not sealed. He says, many shall understand it, and it is true. But he says the Chazone, these events were sealed up to the time of the end. So nobody could understand them until God would signal that they're able to be understood after a time. So here's a quote, Acts of Apostles 585, Ellen White states, the book that was sealed is not the book of Revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel relating to the last days. She's referring to the Chazone vision that was sealed, this portion of the prophecy in Daniel. She quotes Daniel 12:4, the angel commanded, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. So we read this verse. It says, "Thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." The sealed part of the Chazone vision was to be unsealed only after the time of the end was revealed. We keep going, Daniel 12, verses 7 to 9. "I heard the man dressed in linen clothes," which is Christ, "who was standing above the waters of the river, as he lifted his right hand and his left head to heaven, and swore by the one who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. When the shattering of the power of the holy people has occurred, all these things will conclude." So the same mighty angel that we see in Revelation 10 that comes down and stands on one foot in the water and one foot on dry land, and he raises his hand to heaven and swears by him who lives forever, which is the mighty angel, Revelation 10, which is Christ. He's here at the end of Daniel, and he comes down, and Daniel sees the same vision. And he says, these things will be revealed after the time, times, and half a time. And he says, then the shattering power of the holy people, when it's been shattered and taken away, all of these things will come to a conclusion. So he's saying when the papacy falls after 1798, he says, you will begin to understand what all of this means. You will know the end game. Daniel again says, I heard, but I didn't understand. So I asked, what happens next? He answered, go your way, Daniel, because these matters are wrapped up and sealed to the time of the end. So Daniel's already met Gabriel. Now he's having an interaction with Christ. And so he's like, well, I'll just ask your boss. If you won't tell me, I'll go to the source. He says, Christ, what does all these things mean pertaining to the time of the end? And even Jesus turns around and tells Daniel, this doesn't pertain to you. They are sealed up for the time of the end. Go your way. Quit worrying about it. Just write down what I tell you and go on. It's interesting. So this again is the sealed part of the Chazone vision left unexplained to Daniel because it wasn't to be unsealed until after the time of the end. Silence in the New Testament. So let's talk about some things pertaining to this evidence we see throughout Scripture. One of the arguments against the cleansing of the sanctuary by Sunday pastors is that there is no mention in the Gospels or in the writings of Paul about Jesus going into heaven to cleanse the sanctuary on a certain day and what it means and what happens. They say, well, the New Testament is silent about a cleansing of a sanctuary. We only read about it in Leviticus and we only read about it in Daniel. But if it was for us, Jesus would have told us, but it's not there. Therefore, you're wrong. It's not a true teaching. It's one of the biggest objections to the teaching. Well, let's find out why. There's silence in the New Testament regarding the closing ministration in the second apartment of the heavenly sanctuary. Jesus himself never made reference to the cleansing of the sanctuary. But he did make reference to the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in Matthew 24:15, which was not sealed up because that was part of the 70 weeks. And the 70 weeks was part of the 2300-day prophecy in Daniel 9 because Daniel 8 and 9 are connected. And Daniel says this part was not sealed. So Jesus is telling the Jews, this part of the vision that pertains to you as a Jewish nation, the close of your probation, this 70-week, the 490-year prophecy about the Jews, then the Messiah will be in your midst in the last week, and he will cause the sacrifice and an oblation to cease in the midst of the 70th week, which was the crucifixion of Christ. He says that is for you to know. He says that's a time on a calendar that you can mark with a pencil and it'll come true to the day. He says this part to you has not been sealed because it's pertinent for your salvation. So if I was a just and loving God, I wouldn't seal something from you that you need to know to make a life and death decision. So Christ mentions the Mareh in Matthew 24 about the closing events to the Jews because it was not sealed. He was allowed to talk about it. However, Jesus does not make mention about the time of the end or what happens afterward because that part was the Chazone, had nothing to do with the Jews, so that was still sealed. The disciples make no mention about this. There's no comment from a disciple about the Chazone. When we get to the writings of Paul, Paul said he had nothing particular to say about the ministration of the second apartment of the sanctuary, which is a reference to when Christ would go into the most holy place to cleanse the sanctuary after the 2300 years. If you read that in Hebrews 9:5. Paul has a lot to say about the ministration of Christ in the first apartment because all of that was revealed. But he says about when the high priest enters the second apartment, he says, I have nothing to say about it. And that's it. That's the end of the verse, and he goes on to something else. Because Paul says it had not been revealed to what you all need to understand because it doesn't affect the time in which he's living. So the silence on the matter in the New Testament is actually systematically theological because all of the inspired gospel writers who were inspired by the same Holy Spirit who wrote Daniel was following suit of what was opened and what was sealed, so they could only comment on this part that was open. It actually is an argument in our favor of the truth that the Bible does not contradict itself. When we read about William Miller, after 1798, he's trying to study these two prophecies, the Mareh and the Chazone. And we know that he understood them because he used Strong's Concordance, which shows the Greek and the Hebrew. So he knew when he was consulting the text, the word vision was two different words. But he was able to understand one because he set the date. Remember? He says on October 22nd, 1844, he goes, this is the time, this is the day, this is exactly the time. Because it's the same way every other prophecy is used to be made sense of. But what did he get wrong? The event. Because the Chazone was still sealed. It wasn't revealed to Miller what the Chazone was yet. But he got the time right because the Mareh was available to be understood. So he was correct about the interpretation of the time element in Daniel 8:14, but he incorrectly interpreted the event pertaining to the cleansing of the sanctuary because it wasn't revealed yet. We read in Great Controversy 329, he had devoted 2 years, William Miller, to the study of the Bible when, in 1818, he reached a solemn conviction that in about 25 years, Christ would appear for the redemption of his people. I need not speak, says Miller, of the joy that filled my heart in view of the delightful prospect, nor of the ardent longings of my soul for a participation in the joys of the redeemed. The Bible was now to make to me a new book. It was indeed a feast of reason. All that was dark, mystical, or obscure to me in its teachings had been dissipated from my mind before the clear light that now dawned from its sacred pages. And oh, how bright and glorious the truth appeared. So Miller thought he had it, because he says, I have again and again shown it has to be October 22nd, 1844. This is the exact date. He says, and what else could it be? He says he picked the thing, but he was wrong about the event, but he was sure that he was right. So Miller had no light on the meaning of the cleansing of the sanctuary. So now he was just defaulting to what was available in his mind to make sense of. The 2300 morning vision was a part of the Mareh, and that was never sealed. The cleansing of the sanctuary, that was the part of the Chazone vision that belonged to the time of the end, was sealed. That's why he was wrong about the event, but right about the time. It was sealed up because this event did not pertain to Daniel and the generations that would live prior to the time of the end. The signal, though, so here's the thing. What was the signal that showed that the unsealing of the truth about the Chazone with the sanctuary being cleansed? What was the signal? What signified that that vision was now being opened, and as an Adventist people, we could understand it, that God was allowing it to be understood? This picture has a lot to do with the signal that was given in the 1840s. This is Hiram Edson as he was walking through the cornfield the day after October 22nd. It was October 23rd. And as he was walking through the field, he saw a vision of Jesus moving from the first apartment of the heavenly sanctuary to the second apartment. He is going into the most holy place after October 22nd, 1844. And this served as the signal that the sealed message of the cleansing of the sanctuary had now been unsealed. And they realized that they were entirely wrong about the event altogether. But the timing was sure. He says that the timing of the Mareh is true. He says this, Daniel confirmed, he goes, this is exactly the correct time. But even Daniel sought to understand what will happen.
Who is this Edson person?
Oh, he was a Millerite in the 1800s.
Just a regular person? I mean,
Yeah.
was it,
Yeah, average Joe, corn farmer.
I just wondered why God granted that particular person that.
Well, he was studying. He was a part of the men and women who were studying with Miller to understand the truth. So he was faithful to all the light he at the time was given. So what is the implication of these things? Because the Mareh vision of the 2300 evening mornings was never sealed up, it was the privilege of the Jews to understand the prophecies that belonged to them. Because the Mareh had in part the probation of the Jewish people closing. That was part of the Mareh. The first 490 years of the vision pertained to the Jews, as we read in Daniel 9. Because the sealed portion of the Chazone vision had not been fully unsealed since 1844, or after 1844, it is now the privilege of every Seventh-day Adventist today to understand the prophecies that belong to our time. All of the things we've learned since 1844 that are now made available to us. Interestingly, most people don't understand these things. And Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 12 and verse 13 ends, it says, the wise shall understand, but the wicked will not. So the very, 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 very last verse of Daniel, after he talks about the Chazone and the Mareh, and he has this conversation with Christ, and Christ says, write these things in the book. And it says, those will understand. In the very end, he says, a blessing is given to those who understand it, and they shall be wise in their days. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and they shall not understand. And that's how Daniel ends. And so there is this blessing given to the final generation on earth that if you know these things, you shall be wise. Because as the Jews missed the prophecies of the 490 years about the destruction of Jerusalem, it says those who did not understand, they stayed in Jerusalem. The abomination of desolation came, which was the persecution of Rome, and everybody left in the city was slaughtered. But Jesus was telling them in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and Mark 15, all those are the sister passages of the event. He's saying, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place where it not ought to stand, then you shall know, do not go back into your house and collect your things. If you are in the field, do not go back and get your food. He says, go get out of the city, get out of the city, get out of the city, because the time of your visitation has come. And we read in history, every Jew that got out at the sign of the abomination of desolation, their lives were spared and they did not die. But everyone who tarried and stayed lost their lives. So William Miller will stand up in condemnation against the Adventists in the judgment, because even though his understanding of the cleansing of the sanctuary was faulty, he was faithful to that light and preached it fearlessly. If Miller had the light that we now take for granted, his story would have been different. It wasn't revealed to him. He would not have ended up looking like a fool and becoming a laughingstock of the early Christian world pre-1844. Today, we have correct light on the cleansing of the sanctuary, but we as a people do not study it, and we are not passionate about it. So most of these truths go over our heads, and nobody knows they're even there. In the Great Controversy, 409, the scripture which above all others had been both the foundation and the central pillar, that's the load-bearing pillar of the entire structure. You knock the pillar down, it implodes. He says the teaching that is the load-bearing pillar of Adventism was the declaration, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. These had been familiar words to every believer in the Lord's soon coming. By the lips of thousands was this prophecy repeated as the watchword of their faith. That means every potluck conversation they had was about Daniel 8:14 and what it meant for them as a people. They couldn't stop talking about it. Every newsline, every heading, every publication, every book, every sermon was understanding the cleansing of the sanctuary. They couldn't stop talking about it. All that fell upon the events therein foretold depended their brightest expectations and most cherished hope. It was the reason for their joy. Miller will condemn many of these Seventh-day Adventists in the judgment. Jesus himself said that Nineveh would condemn the Jews in the judgment because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and someone greater than Jonah was here asking to them to repent, and they laughed at him. He says, Nineveh will rise up in the judgment and condemn you. All they had was Jonah. He says, you have the Son of God, and you laugh at him. And Jesus was warning them, the probation of the Jewish people is closing. It's the end of the 70 weeks. He says, this is it. And they rejected him. Today, William Miller will condemn Seventh-day Adventists in the judgment because while thousands repented at his preaching of a faulty message, many of us will not heed the call to afflict the soul, even though our understanding of the sanctuary is much deeper and much brighter than what they had in the early 1800s. In Daniel 12, here is the verse, many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. When we look at the Mareh, it's Mareh. There's another word for a vision called the Marah, Marah. You got an AH and an EH. So like in Spanish, hermano, hermana, a reference to two different things, but same base word. In Hebrew, the Mareh is masculine, and it means beholding the very substance. So when Daniel says, I was shown to understand the Mareh, he says he beheld Christ face to face. In other places of Scripture, we read about a Marah, which means a reflection through a mirror of a substance or a shadow. And there are certain visions, like they actually, you know how they had the basin, the laver that they had to polish? It says they had to polish the basin to Marah so that the priest could see the reflection of Christ in the shimmering of the copper basin. That it would be a reflection, that the priest would look into the basin and the image of Christ would be reflected in his character. That's the Marah. And if you do a word study on the Marahs and the Marehs, it'll either be a reflection of Christ in our character or beholding Christ face to face in the Mareh. And I don't have time for that today, but there's more to this study as we continue to learn. So we'll close with the reminder that the wise shall understand. And that today it says Daniel is standing in his lot, which means we can understand these prophecies, that God has resurrected the meaning of his book, and that Daniel can still speak to us because now we're living in the time of the end where these things are no longer sealed, and we can make sense of them, and which is very important for us to know. I think our closing song is 212, which is a most timely song